The stones are old, and they remember. In Massachusetts, the past doesn't just sit still behind glass or plaque. It lingers in hallways, gathers in corners, and sometimes makes itself known long after the lights go out. Tonight, we count down 15 places locals avoid after dark. Sites where history, tragedy, folklore, and unusual sightings combine to make people lock their doors and take a different route home. A quick note before we begin. Some of what follows touches on loss, institutional abuse, and sites tied to real victims. We'll be careful with language and respectful to those affected. Also, none of this is an invitation to trespass. Many of these locations are private property or protected. Do not enter after hours and always follow the law and basic decency. If these kinds of deep dives are your thing, hit like and subscribe. There's more coming. What does it mean to say locals avoid after dark? It's not just superstition. For many of these places, there are documented events in the historical record: rail accidents, trials, hospital wards, shipyards. Layered on top are years of witness reports, cold spots, unexplained footsteps, voices in empty rooms, or lights that shouldn't be there. For others, folklore fills in the gaps. Stories passed down by neighbors, native lore, seafarers' tales. I'll flag the differences as we go, what we can verify in records, what witnesses report, and what lives in local legend. 15. Omni Parker House, Boston. Historically, the Parker House was opened by Harvey D. Parker in the mid-19th century and has hosted presidents, writers, and midnight suppers since the 1850s. Its public rooms have seen deals struck and secrets kept. The building itself has been a continuous presence in Boston's downtown for well over a century. Reported phenomena. Staff and some guests have long described a sense of another presence on the upper floors, a feeling like someone walking past after midnight, a faint perfume on the stairwell that no one can trace, and the occasional sighting of a somber figure in old-style dress disappearing through a door. Servers in the dining room sometimes report small items moved, or a chair that seems to have been used though no one was seated. Anecdote. One night, a night auditor told a story about hearing a woman's laughter echoing down an empty corridor right after the final guests had checked out. When security investigated, every room was empty and the elevators showed no motion logs to explain the sound. Local warning. The Parker House is a working hotel and restaurant with private rooms. Visitors should respect staff and guests and only visit during business hours or on sanctioned tours. Transition. From a polished lobby with chandeliers to a patch of earth with a very different kind of history. Next, a burial ground whose stones have watched the city change around them. 14. Granary Burying Ground, Boston. Historically, established in the 17th century, the granary is the final resting place for revolutionary figures and ordinary citizens alike. Ben Franklin's family, Paul Revere's relatives, and Samuel Adams' grave lie within its plots. Reported phenomena. People who work late or pass by at night sometimes describe an uneasy stillness, pockets of air that feel colder than the rest of the square, and the impression of being watched between the hooded tombstones. Some night shift workers at nearby buildings say distant footsteps cross the path, though no one is there. Anecdote. A security guard once radioed in that a small headstone appeared freshly turned, as if someone had been kneeling there, but when municipal workers checked the stone the next morning, there was no sign of recent disturbance, only the weathering of centuries. Local warning. The granary has visiting hours and is maintained by the city. At night, it is not a place for exploration. Rules protect both the historical site and public safety. Transition. City stones keep secrets, but in other places the past was louder. In Salem, a courtroom and gallows changed lives in 1692, and the memory of that week still shapes how many people move through that town after dark. 13. Salem Witch Trials Sites, Gallows Hill, the Witch House, Salem. Historically, the summer of 1692 left an indelible mark on Salem and surrounding towns. Hangings, accusations, and the jailing of numerous people in a national tragedy that still draws historians and descendants. The Witch House in Salem is one of the few structures with direct ties to that era. Reported phenomena. At night, people report the sense of sobbing or whispered arguments carried on the wind, specters glimpsed in period clothing, and the heavy feeling some visitors describe when standing near locations that once held court or punishment. Guides and museum staff sometimes receive reports from visitors who say they felt a pressure on their chest or an inexplicable cold while walking the old streets. Anecdote. A docent at the Witch House once described a friend who stood in a courtroom room and watched in a reflection a figure vanish at the foot of the bench. No camera footage captured the moment. The witness remains unsettled by the memory. Local warning. This ground represents historical trauma for individuals and descendants. Please treat these sites as living history rather than a ghost hunt. Respect property boundaries and museum hours. Transition. Salem keeps its past visible in wood and brick. Yet another house nearby mixes literature and a different sort of echo. 12. The House of the Seven Gables, Salem. Historically, the colonial mansion that inspired Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1851 novel stands on a lot with 17th-century foundations. The building has been preserved and turned into a museum honoring both architecture and Hawthorne's literary legacy. Reported phenomena. Staff and longtime guides sometimes speak of late-night footsteps echoing along the narrow staircases, quiet sobbing that seems to come from an empty parlor, and the occasional gust of air scented faintly with wood smoke, though all chimneys are cold. Visitors lingering after a closing tour have described an impression of being observed from a high window. Anecdote. A seasonal caretaker reported a wooden toy found in a corner of an upstairs room. They were sure no child had been inside. When they asked around the next day, former staff said similar toys have turned up inexplicably over the decades. Local warning. The Seven Gables is an active museum with private tours. Do not attempt to enter after hours and follow staff requests for decorum and care. Transition. From literary shadows in Salem to the very American story of a brutal domestic crime, Fall River's most infamous house is next. 11. Lizzie Borden House, Fall River. Historically, on August 4, 1892, the double axe murders of Andrew and Abby Borden in Fall River became a national sensation. The house where it happened is preserved as a museum that tells the story and the period details around the case. Reported phenomena. Guests and museum staff report cold spots in the parlor and upstairs rooms, fleeting reflections in mirrors, and the sense that someone is sitting on the end of a bed though the room is empty. Tour guides have had visitors report a tap on the shoulder where no one was standing. Anecdote. On a private group tour, a night auditor later recounted an incident where a security camera outside the second-floor window caught nothing but a smear, later described by technicians as a brief change in pixelation, while a housekeeper who was locking the interior swore she felt breath on the back of her neck. Local warning. The house is a museum and working property. Respect the history and the victims. Do not trespass or attempt to conduct investigations without permission. Transition. Where a single house holds an infamous event, the rust and steel of industry hold other kinds of memory: machines, men, and the sea. 10. USS Salem, United States Naval Shipbuilding Museum, Quincy, Fall River. Historically, the heavy cruiser that now sits as a museum ship at the Fall River Shipyard is a mid-20th century naval vessel, retired to the harbor as a memorial to sailors and shipbuilding heritage. Reported phenomena. Museum staff and volunteers have described late-night footsteps along metal decks, figures that seem to cross a deserted mess hall, and a smell of diesel and sea that swells in empty compartments. Some visitors report the sensation of being followed through the narrow passageways that once bustled with sailors. Anecdote: a night watch volunteer once radioed museum staff after hearing measured footsteps on the main deck. The ship's log showed no scheduled late entries, and the security footage captured only a single, unexplained shimmer of light moving across the polished metal. Local warning: the USS Salem is maintained by the museum and is accessible only during posted hours. Structural spaces are not safe for casual exploration after dark. Be mindful that a ship is not a playground. Sharp surfaces and confined spaces are hazardous. Transition: steel and timber hold impressions too, but some tunnels carry echoes deeper, where men worked in the dark and the earth itself closed in. 9. Hoosac Tunnel, North Adams, Florida. Historically, carved through the Hoosac Range in western Massachusetts in the 19th century, the tunnel project stretched decades and claimed the lives of dozens of workers through accidents, fires, and collapses as the rail line opened in the 1870s. Reported phenomena: within the long, dark throat of the tunnel, later generations have told of bobbing lantern lights far ahead where no workers are present, metallic clanks that start and stop without source, and a persistent drop in temperature that some investigators say registers as an EMF spike, an anomalous electromagnetic reading often mentioned by paranormal teams. Anecdote: a maintenance crew working during the day reported seeing a faint, rhythmic light deep in the tunnel as if someone carried a lantern. But when they traced the point of light with lamps, the area was empty and the light had vanished toward the far mouth where no access was open. Local warning: the tunnel is an active rail corridor in parts and an engineered structure in others. Entering is dangerous and illegal in many sections. Porous ground, water, and confined spaces mean a small misstep can be fatal. Transition: where the tunnel swallows light, some mansions seem to hold it close. Next is a childhood home of stories, a house whose name is tied to a family and a rumor mill. 8. Houghton Mansion, local town. Historically, the stately Houghton residence, associated in local archives with Major Albert C. H. Houghton and Mary Houghton, dates from the later 19th century and has been written about in municipal records for its unusual design and its prominence in the neighborhood. Transition: neighbors have long pointed to the attic windows as the place where a figure sometimes appears after dusk. Dress and posture not aligned with modern clothing. There are reports of the scent of roses in winter, a melodic sing-song drifting through hallways, and doors that close on their own in otherwise locked rooms. Anecdote: one reliable local, someone who once lived 3 houses down, described returning home late to see a light in the upstairs library. They called their neighbor on the phone, and the neighbor, who was visibly shaken on the line, said there was no light at all. Yet for several minutes, both of them watched a warm glow in the windows above. Local warning: the mansion is privately owned. Respect private property and the privacy of any current residents. Do not attempt unauthorized access. Transition: from a private home with whispered music to institutions that held and still hold the weight of public policy and personal suffering. A brief content advisory before the next entries. The following include references to psychiatric hospitals and reported institutional abuse. We'll treat this history with care. 7. Medfield State Hospital, Medfield. Historically, founded in the late 19th century as part of the era's state mental hospital system, Medfield State Hospital housed thousands of patients over decades before parts of the campus were closed and repurposed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Reported phenomena: visitors and former staff report seeing figures in hospital gowns moving through empty corridors, hearing distant cries that resolve into silence when approached, and experiencing a heaviness in certain wards, an atmosphere described more as sorrow than menace. Investigators often note temperature differentials at specific doorways and muffled voices that stop when a recorder is switched on. Anecdote: a former nurse who worked the late shift years ago told of the steady thud of footsteps pacing a disused wing. When maintenance went to investigate, they found only a pattern of scuffed floorboards and a single shoe left by a radiator. The nurse later said the rhythm matched someone she had cared for decades earlier. Local warning: much of the campus has been redeveloped or is private property. The history includes allegations of neglect in the broader state system. Speak of this place with sensitivity to former patients and their families and obey posted signs. Do not enter closed wings. Transition: if Medfield's whispers feel close and human, the next site has been described as a place where architecture itself amplifies the past. A hospital whose halls have become shorthand for New England's institutional history. 6. Danvers State Hospital, formerly State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers, Danvers. Historically, opened in the late 19th century and once known for its distinctive Gothic architecture, Danvers served as a state psychiatric hospital for decades and is associated with the era's evolving and sometimes troubling approaches to mental health care. Reported phenomena: urban explorers and some construction crews who worked on adaptive reuse projects reported sudden drops in temperature, the sense of being watched down long ward corridors, and isolated auditory phenomena, unexplained knocks, distant calls, or a child's laughter echoing in a place no children lived. Many accounts frame the sensation as heavy sorrow rather than aggressive intention. Anecdote: during redevelopment, a contractor shot time-lapse footage of a corridor to monitor progress. Reviewing the footage later, they pointed out a frame where a pale shape appeared to be standing in the middle of the hall for a single second, then was gone. No worker could account for that moment. Local warning: much of the Danvers campus has been redeveloped for private use. Trespassing into construction zones is both illegal and dangerous. Historical conversations about Danvers should acknowledge patient experiences and the evolving standards of care over time. Transition: we've moved from hotels and ships to tunnels and hospitals, each site layered with human work and human cost. The places ahead lean even further into the blurred border where folklore, tragedy, and local memory meet. If your skin is crawling, you're not alone, and the next location carries a particularly maritime chill. The story continues into darker, denser terrain, places where whole neighborhoods change their routes after sundown, where fishermen won't linger at the docks, and where old records and new testimony suggest something persistent in the dark. We'll pick this thread up again shortly, moving deeper into the list and toward the sites that locals single out as the ones they, above all, avoid after dark. If Medfield's whispers feel close and human, the places ahead push farther into the borderland, where story becomes landscape and the landscape answers back. Keep in mind, many of these locations sit on private land or protected sites. They are part of other people's histories and livelihoods. Respect signs, obey the law, and honor those who were harmed here. Now, back to the list. 5. Bridgewater Triangle, southeastern Massachusetts. Historically, the Bridgewater Triangle is not a single building, but a roughly triangular patch of towns and woodlands, centering on Abington, Freetown, and Rehoboth, whose reputation for strange occurrences was popularized by local researchers and chroniclers in the late 20th century. It gathers old mills, glacial ponds, colonial roads, and fragments of indigenous pathways under one uneasy name. Reported phenomena: locals report a strange collage of experiences: sudden bright orbs over swampy clearings, shadowy figures slipping between trees like oversized silhouettes, and animals that behave oddly, dogs refusing to enter certain glades, horses shying away for no visible reason. Folk stories handed down include encounters with small, mischievous beings from Wampanoag folklore, sometimes called pukwudgies in popular retellings. These mentions should be treated as folklore, not ethnographic fact. In addition, there are frequent claims of inexplicable lights skimming over water at odd hours, and of a pervasive sense for some visitors that the woods themselves are watching. If Medfield's whispers feel close and human, the places ahead push farther into the borderland, where story becomes landscape and the landscape answers back. Keep in mind, many of these locations sit on private land or protected sites. They are part of other people's histories and livelihoods. Respect signs, obey the law, and honor those who were harmed here. Now, back to the list. 5. Bridgewater Triangle, southeastern Massachusetts. Historically, the Bridgewater Triangle is not a single building, but a roughly triangular patch of towns and woodlands, centering on Abington, Freetown, and Rehoboth, whose reputation for strange occurrences was popularized by local researchers and chroniclers in the late 20th century. It gathers old mills, glacial ponds, colonial roads, and fragments of indigenous pathways under one uneasy name. Reported phenomena. Locals report a strange collage of experiences: sudden bright orbs over swampy clearings, shadowy figures slipping between trees like oversized silhouettes, and animals that behave oddly, dogs refusing to enter certain glades, horses shying away for no visible reason. Folk stories handed down include encounters with small, mischievous beings from Wampanoag folklore, sometimes called pukwudgies in popular retellings. These mentions should be treated as folklore, not ethnographic fact. In addition, there are frequent claims of inexplicable lights skimming over water at odd hours, and of a pervasive sense for some visitors that the woods themselves are watching. Anecdote. A volunteer fireman from a bordering town once told a newspaper reporter he and his crew would avoid turning down a particular narrow road after midnight. On one quiet summer night, as they passed it, every instrument in their truck briefly cut out: radio, cab lights, dashboard. The crew could see pale lights hovering over a pond ahead, and for a minute none of them could move. The lights vanished as quickly as they came. The truck's systems restarted, and rational explanations remained stubbornly absent. Local warning: the triangle includes private property, wetlands, and unstable terrain. Many stories reference places that are legally posted and ecologically sensitive. Do not trespass, do not disturb wildlife, and do not treat indigenous lore as an invitation to theatrical recreation or cultural appropriation. If you study legends, seek respectful sources, and recognize the difference between folkloric storytelling and tribal history. Transition. Woodlands make room for quieter, cultivated ground. Cemeteries designed as artful parkland sometimes hold a different sort of attention. Next is a burial ground whose monuments have been the focus of late-night accounts for decades. 4. Forest Hills Cemetery, Jamaica Plain, Boston. Historically, established in the mid-19th century as a garden cemetery and arboretum, Forest Hills was intended as a tranquil, intentionally designed landscape, a place of artful monuments, meandering paths, and chapels where families came to remember loved ones. Its rolling terrain and sculpted grounds reflect both Victorian attitudes toward death and the 19th century impulse to create peaceful public green space. Reported phenomena. People who walk the grounds after dark speak of pockets of stillness that feel thicker than ordinary night air, of flash glimpses at the corner of the eye, a shape between trees that resolves into nothing when turned toward. The cemetery's stonework and mausoleums tend to amplify sound, A passerby's footfall can echo oddly, and some night gardeners and late-shift workers have reported hearing the soft sound of conversation carried along a path when no one is visible. Others mention a solitary robed figure seen drifting near the columbarium, an apparition described not aggressively but as intensely present, like an old sentinel who refuses to leave. Anecdote. A longtime groundskeeper once described a summer evening when a jogger called him in a panic, convinced someone was following her. The groundskeeper combed the perimeter with a flashlight and found nothing but a single small bouquet placed on an older stone. No footprints, no bags, no sign of recent visitors. Yet the jogger remained unsettled for weeks afterward, changing her running route. Local warning. Forest Hills is a living cemetery, with families and grave sites. Visiting hours exist for a reason. Respect the memorials and the privacy of mourning visitors, and do not treat any grave as a prop for investigation or pranks. Transition. From stone to water. Coastal towns have their own catalog of warnings. Lighthouses, fishing docks, and offshore shoals that carry seamen's tales along with tragedy. 3. Old North Bridge and the Concord battlefields, Concord. Historically, on April 19, 1775, the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord marked the opening shots of the American Revolution. The Old North Bridge and the surrounding fields are preserved as part of the Minuteman National Historical Park, places where militia and regulars once clashed in the dawn light, forever binding the landscape to those events. Reported phenomena. Battlefield sites often attract reports of residual phenomena, sensory impressions that seem to replay past events rather than interact with the living. At Concord, some visitors over the years have reported the faintest smells of powder on still mornings, an echo of marching, or a sudden prickle at the nape as if unseen boots were padding on the grass. There are occasional claims of distant drum beats that fade as hikers approach, or of white shapes on the ridgelines that resolve into morning mist when investigated. Anecdote. A late afternoon ranger once recounted taking down a visitor's report. A woman said she walked the bridge at sunset and felt a cold hand brush the small of her back as if in a practice drill. When she turned, the bridge was empty aside from the benches and the aging boards. The ranger, who had walked those boards daily for years, admitted he sometimes hears unaccountable rhythms on especially foggy mornings. Local warning. These are public, protected grounds. Do not attempt to reenact or stage scenes, and follow park rules. The path of a national memory is shared by many. Treat it with the deference the place deserves. Transition. The sea keeps its own ledger, and the next shoreline carries a story of shipwrecks, lost lights, and nightly watchfulness along a sandy stretch. 2. Horseneck Beach and the Westport coastline, Westport, South Coast. Historically, the stretch of coastline around Horseneck Beach has long seen the movement of ships along the Massachusetts shoreline. Fishermen, coastal traders, and, in days of heavy storms, vessels forced to shore. While not a single historical headline, the area's maritime tragedies and rescues across the 19th and early 20th centuries seeded local cautionary tales about what waits beyond the sandbar. Reported phenomena. Nighttime beachgoers and fishermen report the sight of a single lantern bobbing on the waves, or just beyond the surf. Lights that some describe as too steady for a drifting buoy and too remote for a boat. Others mention the sensation of being watched from the water, along with distant, unplaceable calls that sound like sailors' voices. Some coastal residents swear they see phantom rowboats along the dark water. No motor sound, just the silhouette of craft moving without wake. Anecdote. A boat owner who works early mornings told a story of locking up his dock one autumn night after a long day. As he turned to leave, he saw a glow on the horizon and, for an instant, a dozen indistinct figures standing on the water's edge. When he blinked, the light had faded, and the shoreline was empty. The only evidence, a line of footprints that began at the water and disappeared into the surf. Local warning. Beaches can be deadly at night. Strong currents, hidden drop-offs, and shifting sandbars make after-dark swims and walks hazardous. Many sections are protected or patrolled seasonally. Obey beach signage, and never assume a folklore story justifies an illegal or dangerous excursion. Transition. From open water to enclosed structures, the final stop on our list is a building that carries a modern, very human tragedy. An urban ruin where fire, loss, and the brisk logic of investigation intersect in a way that keeps neighbors uneasy long after the smoke cleared. 1. Worcester Cold Storage and Warehouse Co. Building, Worcester. Historically, the old cold storage building in Worcester served as a utilitarian warehouse for decades before it fell into disuse. In December of 1999, a fire that began during illegal trespassing and unauthorized exploration spread through the empty floors. The resulting blaze claimed the lives of 6 firefighters who entered the structure while the building was still actively burning, an event that reverberated through the firefighting community and the city itself. Reported phenomena. Abandoned industrial sites accrue atmosphere quickly. Metal stairwells that sing in wind. Concrete that remembers footsteps. Since the fire, some people who pass the boarded windows late at night report a tightness in the air nearby, a smell of smoke like an echo that lingers even when the building is cold, and the impression, described by several urban workers, as a chorus of distant radios tuning in and out. Others describe hearing muffled voices layered beneath the city's hum, voices that stop when someone draws near. Investigators who have legally documented the site have cautioned against attributing every acoustic oddity to something supernatural. Buildings creak and gases shift. Still, the intensity of emotion attached to this place, because it is the scene of recent documented loss, makes it different from an old legend. Many feel the weight of mourning itself. Anecdote. A longtime neighbor said that, for months after the fire, his cat would not cross the street near that block after dusk. He tried carrying the animal past the building. The cat would freeze at mid-block and refuse to proceed until the two were well away. Whether animal instincts or coincidence, the behavior became a local shorthand. Drivers slowed on that corner, not to peer at the ruin, but out of caution. Local warning. This location is private and, for safety and legal reasons, off-limits to unauthorized visitors. The 1999 fire claimed real lives. Discussing the site should center on that human loss and the lessons learned by emergency professionals. Do not trespass, and do not attempt to recreate or monetize a tragedy. From elegant hotel lobbies to coastal shoals, from psychiatric wards to industrial ruins, the map of places locals avoid after dark in Massachusetts is, in fact, a map of what a community decides to leave alone, for reasons practical, legal, historical, and sometimes unnameable. History can settle into a place like dust, and sometimes that dust shifts under our feet. Many reports that make us shiver involve small sensory irregularities, a scent that shouldn't be there, a sudden cold, a light in a window where no light is expected. Other accounts carry heavier freight, documented events, injustices, accidents with clear records that haunt neighborhoods not as ghosts, but as memory-made landscape. As you listen to stories like these, keep 3 things in mind. First, respect. These are sites of real human lives and often real loss. Second, skepticism. Label eyewitness claims for what they are, personal testimony, not proof. Third, safety and law. Curiosity never excuses trespass, vandalism, or risky behavior around fragile structures or dangerous terrain. If this list left you with gooseflesh, that's part of why people keep telling these stories. So the past won't be forgotten, and so communities can decide how to remember. But the sensible next step, if you're intrigued, is not to go alone at midnight with a flashlight. Join a sanctioned tour, consult local historians, and when in doubt, keep your distance. Final note and next episode. If you enjoyed this deep dive into 15 places in Massachusetts locals avoid after dark, subscribe and like to catch our next episode, a practical, safety-first guide to basic paranormal investigation gear, what's useful, what's largely theatrical, and how to approach documentation without breaking the law or your neck. We'll walk through the types of cameras, recorders, and safety measures investigators recommend, and stress ethical approaches to sites tied to real victims. For now, keep your lights on, take the long route home if a road feels wrong, and remember, places remember us long after we leave them. Thanks for watching, stay curious, stay respectful, and we'll see you in the next one.